Jazz Licks Tutorial and Review Number 101 by Longo. Food for thought. As many of you probably know, there has been a raging discussion going on Facebook about the group of young musicians who put out a recording of a note-for-note version of the Miles Davis classic Kind of Blue. As a result, a few comments were made about transcribing in general, with some saying they never transcribed solos and others swearing by it. I mentioned in a comment that I felt that transcribing was one of the best tools for ear training there is, but that I questioned the practice of playing the transcription as a means of learning to play jazz. One of the reasons I feel that way is because of the importance of touch and the role it plays in the rhythmic behavior involved in creating what was transcribed. You cannot transcribe a touch. One can transcribe until they are blue in the face and still not understand the concept that produced what they are transcribing. You can, of course, figure out what notes were played, but that can be very misleading in that they can be played in a time conception that has absolutely nothing to do with jazz. I have even heard musicians read Charlie Parker heads with the accents totally in the wrong places. This has led me to question a practice that has been prevalent in jazz and especially in present-day jazz education, and that is the concept of playing what is commonly referred to as licks. It is a common belief that this is the way to develop a vocabulary that is considered the language of jazz that can later be shaped into one's own identity. After some 50 years playing and teaching jazz, I have come to believe that this may have been a wrong approach all along. Let me examine the ideas that have led me to this conclusion. For some reason, unbeknownst to me, I was blessed to have been chosen to play with Dizzy Gillespie and eventually became his musical director. For me, the experience of this was sheer magic, and the knowledge I acquired from that experience has been unmatched by anything I have ever experienced in my entire life. I also had the immense honor of studying privately with Oscar Peterson, at which time I became acquainted with the great Ray Brown. Some years after this first encounter, I was playing at a club in LA owned by Red Fox, with Dizzy's quintet, and Ray came to hear us. He was impressed with the interplay between Jimmy Merritt, who was Dizzy's bassist at the time, and me. He expressed this to me on our first break and gave me an important piece of advice that had a profound impact on me. Ray said, "Diz isn't going to teach you guys like he did all of us back in the 40s, but ask him questions. Ask a lot of questions." This is something I did over the 26-year association with him that has led me to believe things that are contrary to much of what is commonly thought of about jazz, and also presently being taught. To me, Dizzy wasn't just someone who played jazz, Dizzy was jazz. I remember Miles once stating that he was a branch on the tree of jazz, but that Dizzy was the trunk. Let me now examine some observations that have led me to question some of these concepts. At the advent of what is referred to as the bebop era, Dizzy and Charlie Parker began making some musical statements that were totally unheard of and different than anything prior in jazz. To most musicians and fans alike, a new musical language was born. This was obviously true, however, I now think that how it was born was missed. At that point a practice began in which musicians began copying melodic statements that were made by the innovators, and began considering them the language of modern jazz. Thus the concept of licks was born. This concept is prevalent in today's jazz educational system and is even a part of the lore of many professional players. It is referred to as vocabulary. At the same time we are hearing cries of "I'm tired of the same old stuff, I need to hear something new." Now here is a point I think needs to be considered. Whose licks were Dizzy and Charlie Parker copying? Apparently they were creating the music in an entirely different way. This had to be a result of how they were playing, but everyone started focusing on what they were playing and the lick was born. There are some who will say that a lick is a jumping-off point to put your personal touch on, and this is true to an extent. The question becomes then, is this what Bird and Diz were doing? It is true that certain patterns were practiced and became reference points to embellish rhythmically, but that is a different story. A pattern and a lick are not the same thing. A pattern is a grouping of notes into a logical sequence, that once the rhythmic embellishment begins loses its identity, and becomes several different free-flowing melodies. An example of this can be seen in the tune Donna Lee, in the second and third bars. When you compare this to the bridge of A Night in Tunisia, you will see that they are rooted in the same 2V pattern but are expressed in two totally unique ways. A lick, on the other hand, is something that someone else played and you copied. This is not the result of your own sense of rhythm. I recall when I first started playing at the age of 15 and had the good fortune of playing with some older experienced players who could really swing. Among them was Cannonball Adderley. I would be swinging along in my solo, and as soon as I tried to play a lick I had copied it would throw the groove off and I would be off stride even though it fit the changes of where I was in the tune. I recall back in the 80s when my best friend, James Moody, and I were at my pad in New York. Moody used to stay there whenever he was in this area. We were discussing jazz education and Moody was surprised by my assertion that I didn't believe in the concept of learning licks. He said to me, "But Nickel, don't you think that is necessary to develop a vocabulary?" I immediately said no. To which Moody replied, "Oh." I then asked him to get his soprano sax out, which he did. I then asked him to play the notes in a C9 chord and he played C F G B B D. I then said to him, "Consider each of those notes a drum and start playing rhythms on them." He complied and the most swinging sounds started to emanate from his instrument. I asked him, "Whose licks were you just playing?" He said, "I see what you mean." I then told him to add an upper neighbor tone at the top. In other words, the top D natural goes to D and returns to D natural. After he did that I told him to add that to the rhythms he was making. The next thing that occurred was the melodies started to become more lyrical and get more complex. Then I had him add the lower neighbor tone to the mix. In other words, play the D natural, go to the C below it and return to the D natural. I then told him to add this to his rhythmic behavior and once again the melodies started to behave differently and get even more interesting. Then we combined the two neighbor tone figures with the same pleasing results. We spent the rest of the evening in the same process, adding neighbor tones, passing tones, appoggiaturas, escape tones, etc., to the tones in the chord, and dealing with the rhythms they would suggest to him, and the next thing he knew he was burning the chord up with the most swinging melodic ideas that only he could come up with. He then said the following: "Mikkel, this is really valid. The next morning I was awakened by the sounds of Moody practicing in his room the stuff we were doing the night before, going through several chords in all keys. He came out of his room and thanked me for turning him on to that, but wanted to ask me a question. How do you get from chord to chord this way? What I explained to him was that we were just applying the rhythms to a single chord voicing to just get familiar with the concept, but to get from chord to chord you don't want to think chords but to think of voicings from the top note down and move them to other voicings with the proper voice leading, and then to make the rhythms out of the voice leading itself. Once he caught that concept, he started tearing the changes up. He advised me that I should write a book about this, which I did. It is called The Technique of Creating Harmonic Melody for the Jazz Improviser. It is available at www.jazzbeat.com if you are interested. When the book came out, Moody endorsed it and highly recommended it to musicians. Another book of mine that he recommended is called The Improvised Melodic Line. In this study, the concept of creating melodic lines from rhythm is delved into, and several choices of sources that these rhythms can be applied to or examined. Dizzy once told this pianist in Florida, "Find yourself a rhythm and hang some notes on it." He would say that he thinks rhythm when he improvises and simply puts notes to it. These notes can emanate from patterns, as mentioned earlier, or from scales, modes, arpeggios, runs, etc. Of course, one must consider the source of the rhythm, as just any rhythm will not suffice in the playing of jazz. The rhythmic behavior in Dizzy's music, for example, is the result of a polymetric time conception which includes the simultaneous running of 5/4, 4/4, 6/8, 3/4, and other meters primarily responsible for the melodic rhythms you hear in his playing. I recall Dizzy, in a conversation we had about this, using the term the melodization of rhythm. Through the thousands of hours of playing with him, including many practicing with him at his home in New Jersey, and through following the advice of Ray Brown about asking questions, I learned a hand drum rudiment from him that opens up this polyrhythmic and polymetric behavior. This, coupled with several melodic exercises that act as catalysts for causing this behavior to manifest itself on one's particular instrument, constitute an approach to learning to play jazz that is, in my opinion, far superior than the learning of licks and regurgitating them over chord changes. I have tried to share much of this information in a 4-volume DVD series called The Rhythmic Nature of Jazz, also available from www.jazzbeat.com if you are interested.